Today, let us discuss about cross-cultural communication and issues. First of all, let us think of these questions. What is the role of culture in communication in an organization? How do you understand culture? What are the dimensions of culture? How does cultural understanding help us? It is always better to think of these questions before we enter into the main topic. This is the scientific model of process of communication. Since we are talking about cross-cultural communication and issues, let us begin with the process of communication. As you can see in the picture here, this is the structure of any communication process. We always need two main persons in the process of communication. One is the sender, another is the receiver. And there are of course, so many things between these two people. One is channel, another is medium. Then there are several filters working on the sender and receiver. And sender encodes the communication, whatever. It can be again verbal or non-verbal communication. So, the sender before speaking or writing is encoding the communication. Then when we look at the receiver, he or she is decoding the communication. So, this process is continuous, encoding to decoding, sender to receiver, and in the middle there are channels and media. Then after listening or reading any text or any verbal or non-verbal communication, the receiver will be sending the feedback. Again the process is cyclic, sender, receiver, feedback, it goes on continuously. So, once you understand this process of communication, the remaining part of the topic will be very easy to understand. Let us proceed further. Now, there are many types of communication, but as I just told you before, communication is mainly categorized into verbal and non-verbal communication, but listening is also one of the very important ingredients in the gamut of communication. Speaking, writing, listening. Of course, reading is also there, and if listening is perfect, your speaking will be also perfect. If your reading is perfect, then writing is also perfect. Then we move on to non-verbal communication. This is another important area in the process of communication, because verbally we can see or hear. I mean, if there is a text, we can read. If there is a noise or some voice, we can listen. But non-verbal is only gestures and postures of any person. Without speaking a word, a gesture can hamper the communication process, or it can add value to the communication process. Now, let us look at the non-verbal communication part, which is scientifically called kinesics. Kinesthetics is a scientific term that is related to physics, but here it is kinesics. In that you have gestures, postures and facial expressions. Gestures are hand movements, postures are sitting, standing styles, and facial expressions include your eye movement and facial expressions. Further, scientifically there are so many branches of kinesics, I mean non-verbal communication. There are so many like haptics, oculesics, proxemics, chromatics, chronemics and olfactics. It is a very big subject. So, let us see one by one. Verbal is limited because it is only speaking and writing, but non-verbal is unlimited, and which is more impactful in a communication process than your reading, writing, listening or speaking. Haptics is a study of touch. In communication, what is the role of touch? One may wonder. There is a role, because By touching, if you speak somebody, the communication means difference. Lot of difference will be there. For example, there is a child. If you pat a child on the shoulder, then happily they respond. So, communication is changing. That study of touch is called haptics in communication. Then let us move on to oculesics. Oculesics is study of eye movements. Without speaking a word, one can communicate a lot through eyes. It can be anger, it can be happiness, it can be anything. So, these things can be communicated with eyes. For example, in India, many people do not maintain eye contact, but when it comes to foreigners, if you do not look into the eyes of a person and talk, they do not believe you. It means your oculesics is something wrong. I mean, the movement of your eyes is something wrong. They may think that you are not speaking the truth. So, eye contact is important. That is concerned to oculesics. Then third one is proxemics, the distance between the people, like public distance, private distance, so many types of distance are there. In a public speaking situation, you have a distance between the audience and you, and in a private conversation with a friend or brother or sister, the distance is less. So, based on that, communication is also affected. That specific study is called proxemics. Then we move on to chronemics. Chronemics is related to color. For example, somebody is putting on red color dress or anything, it symbolizes something. In traffic, a red signal, when it comes, everybody stops because it is communicating something. In some countries, red color indicates something else. For example, China, they have red square, red army. So, red color is very auspicious for some country people. In India, it communicates danger. In Africa, it communicates death. So, different colors are communicating different things. So, that specialized color is called chronemics. Next, let us move on to chromatics. Chromatics is a study of timing. In some languages, between the words or between the sounds, there is very limited time. I mean, the timing of words while speaking is different, and in some languages, the speed is too much. For example, South Indian languages like Malayalam, speed is too much comparing to Telugu. So, difficult to understand. And when you move on to North India, different dialects are there, different languages are there. So, the speed of language, the speed of our communication between the words, pauses, all these studies belong to chromatics. Then comes olfactics. Olfactics is a study of smell. For example, fragrance. If somebody or some place is very fragrant, people feel comfortable and your way of communication will be pleasant. Otherwise, if there is a damp weather and the smell is something unwanted, your communication will change. So, all these things without your knowledge influencing the way you are communicating. So, non-verbal is very big study. All these come under kinesics, non-verbal communication. Having discussed about communication and the process of communication, now let us see the role of culture in communication. We are calling it cross-cultural communication because communication across the cultures. You may be in an institution or an organization where people from different cultures are working. So, the way you communicate may not be received by somebody else. For that reason, there is a need to study cross-cultural issues. Even in the corporate sector, in companies where different people from different states or countries are working, for example, multinational companies, different people from different origins are working there. So, naturally, their way of communication, their way of understanding, their feelings, their emotions are different. That is where cross-cultural communication comes into picture. Here, Culture includes appearance, attire, feelings, reactions, traditions, customs, songs, food habits and communication with global technology. I would like to quote Geert Hofstede here, who is an exponent in cross cultural studies. He says, culture is more often a source of conflict than of synergy. Cultural differences are a nuisance at best and often a disaster, quote unquote Professor Geert Hofstede. So, let us go into the details of Hofstede's cultural dimensions now. Additions to Hofstede dimensions. In 1991, Michael Harris Bond added the fifth dimension by conducting research on international students together with Chinese professors. Based on Confucian thinking, Confucius is a philosopher. So, Confucian thinking, that dimension was called long term orientation, LTO, and was applied to 23 countries. In 2010, Michael Minkow generated two dimensions using recent world values. So, this is the background to Hofstede's dimensions. One was a new dimension and the second was more or less a replication of the fifth dimension. The number of country scores for the fifth dimension could now be extended to 93. So, it is a vast empirical study conducted across the world. On one hand, the fifth dimension of Bond and of Minkow correlate strongly, yet the constructs are not fully identical. In 2010 edition of Cultures and Organizations, a sixth dimension has been added based on Michael Minkow's analysis of the world values. This new dimension is called indulgence versus restraint, IND for short. These are the dimensions of Hofstede's study: indulgence versus restraint, long term versus short term orientation, masculinity versus femininity, tolerance versus avoidance, individuality, then power distance. So, these are the cultural dimensions suggested by Hofstede. Now, let us look at these things one by one. Indulgence versus restraint is concerned to individuals who come from a different culture. Some people indulge in some activities, maybe at the workplace or in the society or at home. Some people restrain themselves, they stop themselves from participating in that. So, this is one dimension to the culture. The second dimension is long term versus short term orientation. For example, eastern countries like China, Japan, Indonesia, Singapore, where long term orientation is observed, including India. And if you look at the western side of the world, short term orientation will be there. It means life today is important than tomorrow. But when it comes to India and other countries, eastern countries, long term orientation is important. Similarly, in the third dimension, Hofstede suggests that in certain cultures, masculinity and femininity are observed dominantly. Here, we need to understand that masculinity is not concerned to men only, as well as femininity is not only concerned to women only. Scientifically, as per Hofstede, masculinity is a character seen in any human being. It means dominating or doing some heavy works, adventurous works, thinking about adventures, doing some courageous things. All these are symptoms or characteristics of masculinity, which can be found equally in men or women. So, in certain cultures, masculinity is more. It can be a man or a woman. In some cultures, femininity is more. Look at the history, world history of eastern countries. So many countries invaded India, for example, Mughals, British, Dutch, Portuguese and so on, because of the femininity character in Indians. It means submissive character of the people. You can see many people in the organization, some are dominating, some are very submissive. that belongs to their attitude or personality. That is happening because of their cultural background according to Hofstede. Then comes tolerance versus uncertainty. Somebody is tolerating things for a long time and some are avoiding uncertainty. If there is a problem, they avoid it. Some people stand there and tackle the problem. So, this particular character is happening because of the cultural backgrounds according to Hofstede. Then individuality versus groupism. In some cultures, individuality is more. It means one single person does the task with courage. In some cultures, groupism is seen. For example, India, we celebrate lot of festivals and we have community feeling, we invite people, we go to people and we want to be in groups always. So, that is our cultural background. But Western society, they are highly individualistic. They do not want to mingle with people easily unless they are introduced to them. That friendly nature comes through the culture according to Hofstede. And similarly, in the organizations also, where from different backgrounds people are coming, their mentality may be influenced by their culture, because they may be individualistic or groupist. It depends on the culture of the person. Then finally, we move on to power distance. Power distance is the distance between the people as per the authority or their position. For example, a general manager cannot be equal to a 4th grade employee or 5th grade employee because of the power distance. That too, in eastern countries, power distance is observed more according to Hofstede. He says eastern countries follow power distance very strictly, but when it comes to western countries like USA or UK or Europe, power distance is very less. They call people by name irrespective of their positions. Even a general manager and a driver can have dinner together because they will not have any power distance between them. This is observed in so many countries. For example, Middle East. In the Middle East, where Oman, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, these areas, people, Arab people have the community dinner or 4 or 5 people together having lunch or dinner. You can see that they are treating people equal. For example, a manager and his team or subordinates, drivers, washermen, anybody irrespective of their positions, all of them are sitting together and having lunch, which can be seen in some countries only, whether western or eastern. It depends on the cultural background. So, in Arab countries, 6-7 people sitting around one big plate and having food is a common phenomenon because of their culture. Why are they doing so? Because traditionally they are brought up like that and they are groomed like that. Because of that reason, they are having lunch or dinner together by calling their friends or anybody around. They need not be close friends also. Even then, the culture is binding them together to have food. So, these are the examples of power distance, individuality and mob culture. Now, you can look at various organizations wherever you are working or where you are going to work and try to understand these cultural dimensions and see the role of communication, how these things are influencing the communication. That is the topic, cross cultural communication and issues. Let us go further. Now, this is the description given by Gerd Hofstede: power distance, individualism and collectivism, masculinity and femininity, uncertainty avoidance, Confucius dynamism. Now, let us see 6 dimensions of national cultures in detail. One is power distance. As I told you, power distance is the extent to which the less powerful members of organizations and institutions like the family accept and expect that power is distributed uniquely. It suggests that a society's level of inequality is supported by the followers as much as by the leaders. Power and inequality are extremely fundamental facts of any society, and anybody with some international experience will be aware that all societies are unequal, but some are more unequal than others. Number 2 is individualism, as we discussed, individualism versus collectivism. It is a degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. Groups and teams are always different. Teams are aligned and they have common goal, but groups are just working together in one organization or one department. That is the difference. Everyone is expected to keep an eye on themselves or and their family. Meanwhile, on the collectivist side, we find societies in which people from birth onwards are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, often extended families with uncles, aunts and grandparents, which continue protecting them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. The word collectivism in this sense has no political meaning. It refers to group, not to the state. So, collectivism is seen in eastern countries and individualism is seen more in the western countries. Third is uncertainty avoidance. As I explained just before, uncertainty avoiding cultures try to minimize the possibility of such situations by strict laws and rules, safety and security measures, and on the philosophical and religious level by a belief in absolute truth. There can only be one truth and we have it. People in uncertainty avoiding countries are also more emotional and motivated by inner nervous energy. The opposite type, uncertainty accepting cultures, is more tolerant of opinions different from what they are used to. They try to have as few rules as possible. People within these cultures are more phlegmatic and contemplative and not expected by their environment to express emotions. So, uncertainty avoidance is more in some countries and less in some countries. Fourth is masculinity and femininity. Just now we discussed, it is not concerned to the gender, it is the nature of people. Masculinity is dominance, femininity is submissiveness. Fifth is long term orientation versus short term orientation. This also we have discussed. In eastern countries you have long term orientation and western countries we have short term orientation. Indulgence versus restraint is newly added to cultural dimensions. There is a source given below, you can refer to it. Indulgence stands for a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun. Restraints stands for a society that suppresses gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms. This is the diagram to understand which countries have a low power distance and which countries have high power distance. The map is self-explanatory. Now, one can discuss with examples the following questions just to understand the concept. What is your idea about cultural impact on your business? Which cultural aspects can influence your customers and clients? How do you think cultural issues will affect your products or services? How are you going to deal with the above? And above all, what is the connection between communication and culture? That is the crux of the topic. And people who are working in the institutions like colleges, universities or schools, and those who are working in multinational companies or any companies for that matter, can understand these cultural dimensions and see before communicating. For example, you are writing an email to your manager. From which cultural background is he coming from? Because his ideology, your ideology may be different. his way of understanding and your way of understanding can be different. So, while speaking also, without knowing other person's cultural background, if you try to speak something which can offend the person, that is why it is very important in today's world to understand cross cultural issues before you communicate. Again, please remember, communication is divided into two major parts, verbal and non-verbal communication. Verbally what you are saying may be influenced by non-verbally what you are gesturing. Your face features are saying something and real words are saying something. In written communication that may not happen because it is written text, but while speaking so many things are communicated without your knowledge, which are may be adding value to the essence of your communication or hampering the real communication. So, while discussing about long term orientation versus short term orientation, certain examples can be taken. For example, in India, the average person, a middle class person, way of thinking is that he should or she should have a job, then a small house, then children's education, then marriages, then settling. So, there is a long term planning in Indian mentality. Not only India, all eastern countries are like that, including China, Japan, Philippines, the half sphere, right hand side half sphere of the world. When you look at western sides, an average person thinks about today, how to live today. There is no botheration about tomorrow. Why is it happening? Because the way of culture, the way they are brought up is entirely different from eastern world. Eastern world, you have lot of family relations, joint family system, all these things, collectivism is also there. But western side, you do not have that. At the age of 17 or 18, they start living independently without depending on their own parents. That is their culture, and they do not mind also. And even father will tell the children that you have to study, work and start earning without expecting much from the parents. That is why even the social values, the emotional values, the relationships also are different in the western world. Sometimes we have to be feeling lucky, because in India lot of cultural values will be taught to any child right from their birth to till they die. Lot of cultural orientation keeps on going through their festival, through their habits, through their mind, characterization, everything is taught to them since childhood. That is the greatness of India and other western countries.